It was one of those days where everything felt off. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that made you feel like the world was holding its breath. I had spent the morning staring at my laptop, willing myself to write something, anything. But the cursor just blinked back at me, mocking me. Writer's block had become my constant companion lately, and it was starting to wear me down. I needed a break. Walking aimlessly through the city, I found myself weaving through unfamiliar streets. That's when I saw it. A tiny weathered bookstore tucked between two brick buildings. I'd passed this street 100 times and never noticed it before. The sign above the door was barely legible, the paint chipped and faded. Haven of Lost Stories. Something about the place drew me in. Maybe it was the smell of rain in the air or the way the dim light from inside seemed to pulse, inviting me. I stepped inside and the door creaked shut behind me with a sound that felt louder than it should have. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust. Shelves crammed with books stretched to the ceiling, and the dim lighting made it feel like I had stepped into another time. Behind the counter sat an old man, his glasses perched low on his nose as he read a book so tattered it looked like it might crumble in his hands. He barely glanced up when I walked in, just giving a slight nod. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers over the spines of books whose titles I didn't recognize. Most of them looked ancient, their covers worn and their pages yellowed with age. It wasn't until I turned a corner that I saw it. A leather-bound manuscript sitting slightly askew on a shelf. There was no title, no author, just a simple dark cover with faint scratches across its surface. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It wasn't heavy, but it felt significant, like holding a secret. Curiosity got the better of me and I opened it. The first page was blank, but as I flipped to the next, my breath caught. The handwriting was neat, almost too perfect, and the words, they weren't just telling a story, they were telling my story. My chest tightened as I read. The manuscript described my struggles, my failed attempts to get published, and even the argument I'd had with my landlord last week about the rent. It detailed things no one else could possibly know, right down to the coffee stain on the corner of my desk and the way I always fiddled with my pen when I was stuck on an idea. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. "You found it." The voice startled me, and I nearly dropped the manuscript. The old man from behind the counter was now standing at the end of the aisle, his hands clasped behind his back. "This," I said, holding up the book. "What is this? How does it know?" He interrupted me with a shrug. "Some books choose their readers." I blinked, trying to process what he just said. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you'll get," he replied cryptically. "You can leave it, or you can take it. But once you start reading, you won't stop." I wanted to put it back on the shelf, to walk out of that strange bookstore and never look back. But instead, I found myself at the counter, pulling out my wallet. The old man rang me up without a word, slipping the manuscript into a plain brown bag before handing it over. As I stepped back outside, the rain had started. Fat droplets splattered against the pavement, and I tightened my grip on the bag as I made my way home. Once I was back in my apartment, I sat at my desk and stared at the manuscript. It sat there, innocent and unassuming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting. Finally, I opened it again, flipping through the pages. My hands trembled when I reached the end. The last page wasn't blank like I'd expected. It had one sentence written in the same neat handwriting. "Continue the story." And beneath that, in a handwriting that looked eerily like my own, were 3 words that made my stomach drop. "Or face ruin." I didn't sleep that night. The manuscript sat on my desk, staring at me, even though I'd turned it face down. I couldn't stop thinking about the words on that last page. Continue the story, or face ruin. It wasn't a threat. It was a command. And the worst part? It was written in my own handwriting. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe it was some elaborate prank. But no one I knew could pull off something like this. And besides, there were too many details in the manuscript that only I could know. It was impossible, and yet, it was real. The next morning, I decided to test it. I picked up the manuscript and skimmed through the pages again. My stomach churned as I found a passage that described an email I'd be receiving, a rejection from a literary agent I'd queried last week. The wording was so specific, it felt like someone had hacked my email account and read it before I did. I set the manuscript aside and opened my laptop, refreshing my inbox obsessively. By the time the email arrived, my hands were clammy and my chest felt tight. The rejection was word for word what the manuscript had said it would be. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding. The manuscript wasn't just telling my story, it was predicting it. The day spiraled from there. Around noon, my landlord called, just like the manuscript had said he would. He was angry, warning me that if I didn't get the rent together soon, I'd be evicted. I tried to brush it off, but the unease gnawed at me. The manuscript was 2 for 2, and I didn't want to know what else it had in store. By evening, I was spiraling. The manuscript sat on my desk like a bomb, its blank cover mocking me. I wanted to burn it, throw it out the window, anything to get rid of it. But every time I thought about it, something held me back. Curiosity, fear, maybe both. Finally, I gave in. I opened the manuscript again, flipping to the last page where those haunting words were written. Continue the story, or face ruin. My fingers hovered over the blank space beneath the command. I didn't want to write, but I felt compelled, like the pen in my hand wasn't just a tool, but a key. The moment the pen touched the paper, something happened. The pen moved on its own, scrawling words across the page as if possessed. My hand wasn't guiding it, but I couldn't let go. The story that unfolded wasn't mine. It was someone else's, at least at first. It described a woman, Sophie, who worked at a coffee shop downtown. I didn't know her, but the details were vivid. Her red hair, the way she hummed under her breath when she thought no one was listening, the small tattoo of a crescent moon on her wrist. The pen kept moving, faster now, describing a car accident. Sophie didn't survive. I yanked my hand away, gasping. The manuscript fell silent, the page blank except for the words I'd just seen appear. I wanted to believe it was just a story, a coincidence, but something deep inside me whispered otherwise. The next morning, I couldn't stop myself. I went to the coffee shop the manuscript had described, and there she was, Sophie, with her red hair and her crescent moon tattoo, humming quietly as she worked the espresso machine. I wanted to warn her, to tell her to stay away from cars, but how could I? How do you tell someone their life is written in a cursed book without sounding insane? By the next day, the news hit. A fatal accident on Fifth Avenue. A car had jumped the curb, hitting a pedestrian. The victim was Sophie. I stared at the headline, my heart pounding. The manuscript hadn't just predicted her death, it had caused it. I was sure of it. I tried to stop writing. I shoved the manuscript into a drawer, buried it under piles of old notebooks, and told myself I wouldn't touch it again. But the whispers started. Faint at first, like someone speaking just out of earshot. By the third day, they were deafening, circling in my mind like a storm. Write, write, write. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The manuscript wasn't just predicting the future, it was creating it. And now, it wanted me to keep going. I was trapped. I was losing my mind. The whispers followed me everywhere now. They weren't just in my head. They seemed to echo from the walls, the floor, even the pages of the manuscript when it sat closed on my desk. I tried leaving my apartment, walking aimlessly through the city to clear my head, but the whispers came with me, faint, insistent, a constant murmur. Write, finish, you can't stop. I hadn't touched the manuscript since Sophie's death. The thought of writing again terrified me, but every moment of resistance felt like a losing battle. It wasn't just the whispers, it was the weight of it, pressing down on me, making it hard to think, to breathe. Finally, I snapped. Fine, I shouted at the empty apartment, my voice cracking. You want me to write? I'll write. The whispers stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse, but I didn't care. I stormed to my desk, yanked open the drawer, and pulled out the manuscript. My hands shook as I flipped to the next blank page, the pen trembling between my fingers. The moment the tip touched the paper, the pen took over, pulling me into a story I couldn't control. It started innocently enough. A man named Peter working late in his office. A regular guy with a wife and 2 kids. But as the words spilled out, I realized where this was going. Peter wasn't going home that night. The story described a fire, small at first, then raging out of control. His office building would burn to the ground and he wouldn't make it out. No, I whispered, trying to pull my hand away. But it was like the pen was glued to my skin. The harder I resisted, the faster it wrote, scrawling words that felt more like commands than predictions. Peter's death was just the beginning. The story jumped to other people, a woman on a bus, a jogger in the park, a family sitting down for dinner. Each of them met a tragic end, and I couldn't stop it. By the time the pen finally released me, my body was trembling, drenched in sweat. The manuscript sat on the desk, its pages filled with horrors I had unwillingly written. The next day, the news confirmed everything. The office fire, the bus crash, the hit and run in the park. Every detail matched what I had written. I didn't leave my apartment after that. I couldn't bear to see the world unraveling around me, knowing it was my fault. But the manuscript wasn't done with me. The whispers came back, louder than ever, demanding I write more. When I refused, the manuscript began to change. Words appeared on its pages without my touch, describing me, my thoughts, my fears, my moments of weakness. It knew everything. That's when I realized I wasn't just a pawn in this story. I was its target. I flipped through the manuscript, desperate to find a way out. Buried in the middle of the pages, I found a passage that made my stomach drop. It was my handwriting again, though I had no memory of writing it. You are the author. You always have been. This is your creation, and you cannot escape it. My breath caught. My vision blurred. It didn't make sense. I didn't create this. I found it, didn't I? Memories flickered in my mind, hazy and fragmented. Late nights at my desk, scrawling words on paper. Stories that didn't make sense, that I never shared with anyone. Could it be true? Had I written the manuscript long ago and forgotten it? I tore through the pages, searching for answers, but they only raised more questions. The manuscript seemed alive, its words shifting when I looked away. Whole sections disappeared, replaced by new ones that deepened my confusion. And then the whisper spoke clearly for the first time. Finish it. The words sent a chill down my spine. I understood now. The manuscript wasn't just a story, it was a trap, and I was its prisoner. Desperate, I decided to destroy it. I grabbed a lighter from the kitchen and held it to the edge of the manuscript. The flame caught, curling the pages and filling the room with smoke. For a moment, I thought I'd won, but when I turned back to my desk, the manuscript was there, untouched, its cover pristine. No, I whispered, backing away. The whispers roared in my ears, deafening. The manuscript flipped open on its own, its pages turning violently until it landed on a new passage. My heart sank as I read the words, written in my handwriting once again. You can't destroy what you are, the only way out is through. Through? What did that mean? My mind raced, trying to piece it together. But deep down, I already knew. I had to finish the story. The manuscript wouldn't let me stop. And now it wasn't just threatening strangers, it was threatening me. The manuscript had won. I sat at my desk, staring at the cursed pages, my mind a storm of fear and anger. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an unbearable silence. It was waiting for me, daring me to pick up the pen again. I didn't want to give in, but I knew there was no other choice. The only way out is through. Those words echoed in my head. If I didn't finish the story, the manuscript would consume me entirely. Maybe it already had. With trembling hands, I picked up the pen and touched it to the paper. It moved immediately, writing with a force I couldn't control. My hand wasn't my own anymore. Guided by something dark and relentless, the words spilled out, describing events I didn't fully understand, faces I'd never seen, places I'd never been. Each one ended in horror. A mother losing her child, a man betrayed by his best friend, a woman left alone in the dark. It was as if the manuscript fed on their suffering, growing stronger with every word. And then it turned on me. The next paragraph was about a writer. It detailed his life in excruciating detail. His dreams of success, his failures, his descent into obsession, my descent. The story painted a picture of a man who found a manuscript just like I had, and became trapped in its cycle. It described me sitting at my desk, pen in hand, writing these very words. No, I whispered, trying to pull my hand away. But the pen wouldn't stop. The story continued, spelling out my fate in cold, unyielding detail. It said I wouldn't escape, that I was doomed to repeat this over and over, trapped in an endless loop of writing and suffering. My heart pounded. This couldn't be it. There had to be a way to break the cycle. And then I saw it, a faint memory, like a shadow flickering at the edge of my mind. I had written this manuscript before. I didn't remember when or how, but the feeling was undeniable. It was mine. And if I had created it, maybe I could destroy it. The only way out is through. I knew what I had to do. The pen stopped moving, the last words hanging ominously on the page. I grabbed the manuscript and flipped to the final blank sheet. My hands shook as I wrote, forcing myself to take control. The story ends here. The words stared back at me, bold and final. The manuscript seemed to resist, the pages vibrating beneath my hands as if trying to tear themselves free. But I kept writing. No more cycles, no more victims, it ends with me. The manuscript fought harder. The whispers returned, louder than ever, screaming in my ears, but I didn't stop. I poured every ounce of my will into those final lines, forcing the story to close. When I finished, the manuscript went still. The whispers stopped. The room felt impossibly quiet, as if the world itself had been holding its breath. I stood, my legs unsteady, and carried the manuscript to the kitchen. This time, when I lit the flame, it burned. The pages curled and blackened, the leather cover cracking as the fire consumed it, the air filled with acrid smoke. But I didn't look away. I watched until nothing remained but ashes. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. But as I turned back toward my desk, something caught my eye. Sitting there, as if it had never left, was the manuscript, pristine, untouched. "No," I whispered, backing away. "I ended it." The manuscript flipped open on its own, revealing a single line written in my handwriting. "You can't destroy what you are." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The manuscript wasn't just a story, it was me, my creation, my curse. I felt myself fading, my body growing lighter, my mind unraveling. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the manuscript closing itself, waiting patiently for the next person to find it. Weeks later, in a quiet bookstore downtown, a young woman browsing the shelves paused. Her hand hovered over a leather-bound manuscript, its blank cover drawing her in. She picked it up, flipped through the pages, and smiled. Something about it felt familiar. When I first saw the house, I wasn't sure if it was charming or just plain creepy. It had that old New England vibe, a big, weathered colonial sitting alone at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to press in from all sides. The real estate agent called it secluded, which I guess is just a fancy way of saying isolated. But that was the whole point. I wanted a place where people could heal, where they could get away from the noise of their lives and find some peace. My name's Gabriel Cooper, by the way. I'm a therapist. For years, I'd been dreaming about starting a retreat for my patients, somewhere they could step away from their trauma and just breathe. This house seemed perfect. A little rundown, sure, but nothing a few renovations couldn't fix. And the price was almost too good to be true, which should have been my first red flag. The agent, a chipper guy named Andrew, gave me the tour with his rehearsed enthusiasm. "This house has a lot of history," he said, gesturing at the creaky staircase. "Built in the late 1800s, solid bones, just needs a little love." I nodded along, but something about the place felt off. Maybe it was the way the floorboards groaned under my feet, or the way the shadows seemed to linger in the corners. Still, I told myself I was overthinking. It was just an old house, after all. "About the basement," Andrew said as we passed a heavy door at the end of the hall. His voice had dropped slightly, almost like he didn't want me to hear him. "It's locked. Reinforced, actually. The previous owner, Mr. Hargrove, was very particular about keeping it secured. We don't have a key." "Why's that?" I asked, stopping in front of the door. It was solid, steel reinforced with thick bolts running across it. Not exactly the kind of thing you'd expect in a country home. Andrew gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, you know, some people are just eccentric." He was into all kinds of hobbies, renovating, collecting antiques. "I'm sure there's nothing unusual down there." "Right, nothing unusual." The tour ended, and despite the weirdness with the basement, I made an offer that afternoon. By the end of the week, the house was mine. Moving in was a mix of excitement and dread. I brought a few essentials: books, my favorite coffee maker, a couple of plants to brighten the place up. But the house still felt empty, like it was holding its breath. It wasn't until my first night there that I realized just how quiet it was. No cars, no neighbors, not even the sound of birds. Just me and the creaks of the old wood settling. And then at around midnight I heard it. At first it was faint, just a low murmur, like the hum of an old radiator. I ignored it, figuring it was the house making noises, but as the minutes ticked by, the sound grew louder. It wasn't random anymore. It was rhythmic, like someone whispering just on the other side of the basement door. I got up, heart pounding, and tiptoed down the hallway. The door looked the same as before, locked, silent, unassuming. But as I pressed my ear against it, the murmur stopped, replaced by a deep, hollow silence that made my skin crawl. I backed away slowly, shaking my head. "It's just your imagination," I muttered to myself. "You're tired. It's been a long day." But the unease stayed with me, crawling up my spine and settling at the base of my neck. The next morning, while unpacking books for my office, I found something hidden behind one of the built-in shelves. It was a stack of old journals, their leather covers cracked and faded with age. The handwriting inside was neat but frantic, like the words had been scrawled in a rush. They belonged to someone named Thomas Hargrove, and the more I read, the more I realized this wasn't just the rambling of some eccentric homeowner. These journals told a story, one about rituals, voices, and something he called the shadow below. I couldn't stop thinking about those journals. There were 5 of them in total, each one filled with pages of tight, frenzied handwriting. The first few entries seemed normal enough. Hargrove talking about his love for the house, his passion for restoring antiques. But it didn't take long for things to take a darker turn. In one entry dated July 2nd, 1987, he wrote,
"There is something in the basement. I heard it again last night. A low hum, almost like breathing. At first I thought it was the pipes or the wind, but no. It's deeper than that. It's alive."
I read those words over and over, my stomach churning. It was the same sound I'd heard my first night here, the whispers. Another entry, weeks later. "The door won't hold much longer. I reinforced it again today, added more bolts, but I can still hear it. It knows I'm here. It knows everything about me. It speaks to me now in the voice of my mother. She's been dead for 20 years, but it sounds just like her. How is that possible?" I slammed the journal shut and pushed it away, trying to ignore the knot tightening in my chest. It was just a story. That's what I told myself. Hargrove was clearly unstable, maybe even paranoid. Whatever he thought he heard in the basement was probably just the wind or a broken furnace. I mean, what else could it be? But the unease didn't go away. That night, as I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, the murmurs started again. They were louder this time, more distinct. Not random noises, but actual voices. And not just any voices, familiar ones. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips, as I recognized the voice of Amanda, one of my patients. She'd been coming to me for months, working through the trauma of losing her child in a car accident. I could hear her now, clear as day, whispering, "I should have saved him. I should have done more. It's my fault." The glass slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor. "No," I whispered, backing away from the sound. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping, filling the room until I couldn't tell one from the other. Amanda, Ethan, Laura, every patient I'd ever worked with, their words spilling out in a chaotic, endless loop. And then they said my name, Gabriel. It was barely above a whisper, but it felt like it had been shouted in my ear. I turned toward the basement door, my heart hammering in my chest. The voices were coming from there. The locked door seemed to pulse, as if something on the other side was trying to break through. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my keys, get in my car, and never look back. But my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I found myself walking toward the door, drawn by the sound. My hand trembled as I reached out, fingers brushing against the cold steel. The voices stopped. The silence was worse. I stumbled back, my breathing shallow, and fled to my office. I needed to calm down, to distract myself. I grabbed the second journal and flipped through it, desperate for answers. Hargrove had written extensively about the entity in the basement. He called it the shadow below, and claimed it wasn't just a spirit or a ghost. It was something older, something that fed on secrets and pain. It used the voices of the people you loved, or the people you'd hurt, to break you down, to make you vulnerable. And once it had you, it wouldn't let go. I tried to leave. One entry read, "I made it as far as the end of the driveway, but the voices followed me. They grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't take it anymore. The house won't let me go. It knows what I've done. It knows who I am." I slammed the journal shut, my pulse racing. None of this could be real. Hargrove had clearly been unwell, spiraling into paranoia. That's all this was, a man losing his grip on reality. And yet, the voices, the whispers, the way the house seemed to breathe around me. I looked at the locked door across the hallway, and for the first time, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just Hargrove's story anymore. It was mine. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it. The voices, the journals, the locked door, they were all connected. And whatever was in that basement wasn't going to let me pretend otherwise. The house felt different now, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I spent the next day pacing the living room, the hallway, even the kitchen, trying to come up with a plan. What do you do when you're not even sure what you're up against? Part of me wanted to call someone, a friend, the police, anyone. But how do you explain something like this? "Hey, there's a demon in my basement that sounds like my patients." Yeah, that would go over well. By nightfall, I made up my mind. I couldn't keep living like this, haunted by whispers and shadows. I had to open the door. I had to see what was down there. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, I approached the basement door. The air felt heavier with each step, pressing against my chest like a weight. The murmurs started again, soft at first, but growing louder as I got closer. This time, they weren't just the voices of my patients. They were my own voice, too.
Gabriel, it whispered. You know why you're here. You've always known.
My hand shook as I slid the crowbar into the crack of the door. With a deep breath, I pushed, forcing the bolts to groan under the pressure. It took 3 tries before the lock gave way with a loud metallic snap. The door swung open slowly, revealing a set of steep wooden stairs descending into darkness.
The smell hit me first. Damp, rotting wood mixed with something sharper, metallic. Blood. My stomach churned, but I pressed on, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The beam cut through the thick shadows, revealing the stone walls and dirt floor of the basement.
Symbols were scrawled everywhere. On the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. Circles, runes, shapes I didn't recognize, all drawn in what looked like charcoal or ash. At the center of the room was a large circle etched into the ground, surrounded by candles, now burnt down to stubs. The air felt electric, humming with an energy that made my skin crawl. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, something dark and shifting at the edge of the light. But as I stepped closer, it grew more defined. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. A mass of shadows and flickering, glowing eyes, moving in ways that didn't make sense. It wasn't solid, but it felt real. It felt alive.
Gabriel,
it said, its voice a cacophony of whispers, 100 voices speaking at once. Amanda, Ethan, Laura, my own voice too.
You've come at last.
I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand.
What are you?
I managed to choke out. It laughed, a sound that wasn't quite laughter, more like the sound of glass breaking and metal grinding. You know what I am. I am you. I am every secret you've buried, every lie you've told, every pain you've ignored. You brought me here.
That's not true, I said, shaking my head. You're not me. You're something else.
Am I? It whispered, stepping closer. Its form shifted, taking on shapes that sent chills down my spine. A face I didn't recognize, then one I did. Amanda, her eyes hollow and accusing. You couldn't save me, it said in her voice. You never wanted to.
Stop,
I whispered, backing away, but it didn't stop. It changed again. Ethan, his voice trembling. You pushed me too hard. You broke me.
No,
I shouted, the word echoing off the stone walls.
You're lying.
It shifted one last time, and this time, it was me, my face, my voice, staring back at me with a smirk that didn't belong to me. You've spent your life pretending to fix people, it said, but all you've done is project your own darkness onto them. You don't heal, Gabriel. You destroy. I dropped the flashlight, my knees giving out as I sank to the ground.
No,
I whispered, tears streaming down my face. That's not true. I've helped people. I've lied, it interrupted, leaning closer. You lied to them. You lied to yourself. And now you've brought them all here, to me. The candles around the circle flared to life, their flames unnaturally bright. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. The thing, I reached out a hand, its fingers stretching impossibly long, wrapping around my chest like smoke.
Let me go,
I screamed, struggling against its grip, but there was no escape. The shadows seeped into my skin, filling me with a cold that burned, a weight that crushed. I felt my mind fracturing, breaking apart piece by piece, until all that was left was darkness. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the basement anymore, or at least not the basement I remembered. The room around me stretched endlessly, its walls lined with mirrors. Each one reflected a different version of myself, flickering like static on an old TV. Some versions were smiling, others screaming. In one I was drenched in blood, in another I was a child, curled into a ball, sobbing. The air was heavy, pressing down on my chest, and the voices were louder than ever. They weren't coming from the mirrors or the walls. They were inside me. Each whisper, every accusation, echoed in my mind, weaving together into one undeniable truth. I couldn't escape this. Not anymore. Gabriel, the voices called, overlapping in a sickening harmony. Why do you run from what you are? I staggered forward, my legs trembling. My reflection in the nearest mirror moved, but it wasn't copying me. It stared at me with hollow, sunken eyes, a twisted smile stretching across its face. Stop, I whispered, clutching my head. This isn't real. The reflection laughed, its voice a distorted echo of my own. Real? It sneered. You've built your life on lies, Gabriel. You hide behind your patients pretending to help them, but all you've done is project your own darkness onto them. You don't heal. You feed. No, I said, louder this time, forcing myself to look away. I've helped people. I've made them better. The laughter grew louder, reverberating through the endless space. The mirrors around me began to shatter, one by one, each exploding into shards that floated in the air like razor-sharp snowflakes. And yet the reflections remained, now suspended in the shards, watching me from every angle. You can't even admit the truth to yourself, the voices taunted. You've locked away your pain, your guilt, your fear, but it's all still here. You can't escape it. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I don't deserve this, I shouted, my voice cracking. I'm not like you. Then prove it, the voices challenged. The floor beneath me began to shift, the symbols from the basement reappearing, glowing faintly. The shadows coalesced into a figure again, this time resembling me more than ever. It stepped closer, and I felt the cold radiating from it, seeping into my bones. You think you're better than me? It hissed, its eyes boring into mine. You're not. You've ignored the truth for so long that I had to bring you here. I had to show you what you really are. I fell to my knees, the weight of its words crushing me. It wasn't wrong. Deep down, I knew that. I'd spent years burying my own trauma, pretending it didn't exist, and instead channeling it into others. I told myself I was helping them, but I was only running from myself. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Acceptance, it said, crouching down to meet my gaze. You don't have to fight me. I am you. You've always been afraid to confront the truth, but the truth is the only way out. My hands trembled as I stared into its eyes. My eyes. Could I do it? Could I face everything I'd locked away for so long? The memories I avoided, the guilt I suppressed, the shame I ignored? I didn't know if I was strong enough, but I knew I couldn't keep running. I'm not afraid of you, I said, forcing the words past the lump in my throat. Not anymore. The shadow smiled, a slow, eerie grin. Good, it whispered. The room around me exploded into light, blinding and all-encompassing. For a moment, I thought I'd won, that I'd broken free. But as the light faded, I realized I was still in the basement. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, and the air was still heavy, suffocating. The shadow was gone, but I could feel it, inside me now, a part of me. I stumbled up the stairs, my legs weak, my body trembling. When I reached the main floor, I collapsed onto the living room couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. The house was silent now, but the weight of what I'd seen, what I'd done, hung heavy in the air. I stayed like that for hours, maybe days. When I finally found the strength to move, I realized something. I couldn't leave. The house wouldn't let me. Every time I approached the door, my legs froze, my chest tightened, and the whispers started again, faint but insistent. I understood then. The house wasn't holding me captive, I was. When I first pulled up to the Pinewood residences, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. It was old. Brick walls streaked with soot, windows that seemed too small for the building's size, the kind of place you'd see in a low-budget horror movie. But I wasn't in a position to be picky. After what I'd been through, all I needed was a cheap apartment, a fresh start, and some space to figure out my life. Inside, it was a little better, or at least cleaner. The smell of musty carpet mixed with lemon cleaner greeted me as I lugged my suitcase to the elevator. It rattled and groaned all the way up to the 4th floor, which, thankfully, was mine. I didn't meet any neighbors on my way in, just the echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the narrow hallway. I found my door easily enough, 4C, and the lock turned without a fight. The apartment wasn't much. Cracked tiles in the kitchen, faint stains on the carpet, but it was mine. I thought I'd have some peace once I settled in, but that's when I noticed the door at the end of the hallway. It wasn't like the others. Most of the doors were standard, wood, paint peeling in places, numbers bolted on in brass, but this one was metal, black, no number, and the lock. It looked ancient, like something you'd see in an old castle. I didn't think much of it at first. Just weird architecture, right? I assumed it led to some maintenance closet or storage room. Still, there was something about it that stuck with me. The way it seemed to almost absorb the dim hallway light, standing out despite its simplicity. A knock at my door broke my thoughts. It was Mrs. Harper, my neighbor from across the hall. She was one of those sweet older ladies with a thick southern drawl and a habit of mothering anyone she met. "Just thought I'd welcome you to the building," she said, handing me a plate of cookies. "You need anything, sugar, you come knock on my door, all right?" We chatted for a while, and then, almost as an afterthought, she added, Oh, and stay away from that door at the end of the hall. Her tone shifted, her cheery demeanor dimming for just a second. It's nothing good, trust me. I laughed nervously, brushing it off. What is it? Some kind of haunted closet? Her face turned serious. Just don't go near it. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't get the door out of my head. I tried to chalk it up to nerves. New place, new surroundings. It made sense I'd latch on to something weird. But when the clock hit midnight, I heard it. A faint knock. At first, I thought it was coming from my door. I sat up, heart pounding, but the hallway outside was silent. Then it came again, louder this time. Not from my door, from the black one. I told myself it was nothing. Pipes creaking, old buildings settling. But then there was a scream. Not loud, muffled, like someone yelling into a pillow. It came and went so quickly I almost thought I imagined it. Almost. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I bumped into James, another neighbor. He was a delivery guy, always wearing his uniform even when he wasn't working. He had this laid-back vibe like nothing could faze him. "Hey, new girl," he greeted me. "Settling in all right?" "Yeah, it's fine," I replied, hesitating before adding, "Hey, can I ask you something? What's the deal with the door at the end of the hall?" His smile faltered. "What do you mean?" "You know the black door? Mrs. Harper told me to stay away from it." James glanced toward the end of the hallway, his expression turning unreadable. "Just listen to her, okay? People don't mess with that door for a reason." "What kind of reason?" I pressed. He shrugged, backing away toward the elevator. "You don't want to know." By the time I got home that evening, my curiosity was in overdrive. I couldn't stop thinking about the door. Who, or what, was behind it? Why were my neighbors so weird about it? As I unlocked my apartment, something on the floor caught my eye. A small box, sitting right in front of the black door. It wasn't there before. That box haunted me all night. I didn't even touch it. Just left it there by the door like some sort of cursed package. But even after I closed my apartment door, I couldn't stop wondering, who left it? Why? By morning, my curiosity had won. I peeked out into the hallway, half expecting the box to be gone. But it was still there, sitting in front of the black door like it was waiting for me. I looked around, empty hallway. Taking a deep breath, I walked over and crouched down. The box was small, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine. No name, no address, nothing. My hands hovered over it for a second before I finally grabbed it and darted back into my apartment. Inside, I unwrapped it like I was defusing a bomb. What I found wasn't dangerous, but it was unsettling. A leather-bound journal, old and worn, like it had been through hell and back. The initials EM were stamped on the front. I flipped through the pages, expecting, random notes or sketches. But it was full of entries, detailed, frantic writing. Whoever wrote it had lived in this building and they had some serious issues with that door. One entry stood out. "It knocks every night now. It's louder, like it's closer. The others don't hear it, or they pretend they don't. But I know they know. They're scared, just like me. I need to leave before it's too late." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't normal. Maybe it was some kind of joke, like the journal was planted to freak out new tenants. But then why would the neighbors act so weird about the door? I shoved the journal into a drawer and tried to focus on my day, but my mind kept circling back to it. Later, when I ran into Mrs. Harper again, I decided to ask her. "Mrs. Harper," I started, trying to sound casual, "do you know who used to live in 4C? The person who lived there before me?" She froze, her hands gripping the basket of laundry she was carrying. "Why are you asking about them?" "No reason," I lied. "Just curious." She gave me a hard look, her usual warmth replaced by something colder. "You shouldn't be digging into the past, Clara. Some things are better left alone." I wanted to push her, but she shuffled off before I could say more. That night, the knocking started again. Soft at first, then harder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from my door this time. It was definitely the black door. I turned off all the lights in my apartment and crept to my peephole. The hallway was empty. Still, the knocking continued, and then I heard it. A voice. "Please, help me!" It was faint, but clear enough to make my stomach flip. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The knocking stopped immediately. The silence was worse. I backed away from the door, heart pounding, and sat on the couch, clutching a pillow like it could somehow protect me. The journal was on my mind again. Maybe there was something in there that could explain what was happening. I dug it out and flipped through the pages more carefully this time. One entry caught my eye. "They say it's just a door, but it's not. It's a trap, a test. You can't trust what's on the other side. And once you open it, it's too late. The door chooses you." It waits. It watches. It knows when you're weak. My pulse raced. I slammed the journal shut and paced the apartment, trying to make sense of it all. Was this real? Or was I just letting my imagination run wild? I decided I needed answers. The next morning I cornered James by the mailboxes. "Okay, seriously," I said, cutting him off before he could brush me off again. "What's the deal with the black door?" He looked over his shoulder like someone might overhear. "I already told you to leave it alone." "Why? What's behind it?" James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, every building has its quirks, okay? Just don't mess with it. Trust me, that's not an answer." "I don't have answers," he snapped, louder than he probably intended. Then, in a lower voice, he added, "But I do know that people who start asking questions about that door don't stick around for long." He walked away before I could press him further. That evening, as I was locking up after work, I noticed something new. The door. It wasn't locked anymore. The old rusted padlock that had been there since I moved in was gone, leaving the door slightly ajar. I froze, staring at the dark sliver of space where the lock used to be. My stomach churned, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and go back to my apartment. But I couldn't. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. There was a staircase. I don't know what I expected to see behind that door. Maybe a supply closet, maybe some dusty old maintenance equipment. But a staircase? That wasn't just weird. It was wrong. The stairs were old, cracked concrete, spiraling down into the dark. A faint light flickered from somewhere below, its cold, bluish glow casting eerie shadows along the walls. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand gripping the edge of the doorframe, trying to convince myself to walk away. But I didn't. There was this pull, like gravity, but worse. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something I couldn't fight. I grabbed my phone, switched on the flashlight, and stepped inside. The air changed immediately. It was damp and cold, with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The walls were close, almost suffocating, and as I descended, the sound of my footsteps echoed in ways they shouldn't have. It didn't feel like I was going deeper into the building. It felt like I was leaving it entirely. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in what looked like a mirror image of my hallway, but distorted. The walls were damp, the paint peeling in long, curling strips. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead was replaced by an unsettling silence. And the doors. They were all there, in the same places as on my floor, but they weren't the same. They were warped, sagging inward like they'd been soaked in water and left to rot. Scratches covered the surfaces, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by something desperate. I walked slowly, my flashlight scanning the space. Every few steps, I thought I heard movement. Soft, shuffling noises, like someone dragging their feet. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No response. As I passed one of the doors, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye. I spun around, shining my flashlight on it, but it was just a trick of the shadows. At least, that's what I told myself. At the end of the hallway where my apartment would have been, I saw it. A figure. It was a man, crouched in the corner with his back to me. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his shoulders heaved like he was sobbing. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond. I took a cautious step closer. "Do you need help?" This time he moved. Slowly he turned his head and I froze. It wasn't a face. It was something else. Something wrong. The features were stretched, distorted, like a melted mask. His eyes were too big, too dark, and they locked onto mine with a hunger that sent ice through my veins. He stood up, his movements jerky, unnatural, and started toward me. "Stay back!" I yelled, backing up so fast I nearly tripped. But he didn't stop. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, and no matter how fast I moved, the sound of his footsteps stayed close behind. Too close. I reached the staircase and scrambled up 2 steps at a time, barely daring to look over my shoulder. When I reached the door at the top, I threw myself against it, slamming it shut just as his hand shot out, inches from my face. The force of the door slamming knocked me to the ground, and for a moment I just lay there, gasping for air. The hallway outside my apartment was silent and unchanged, but I knew better. Something had followed me. I stumbled to my feet and ran to Mrs. Harper's door, pounding on it. She opened it after a few seconds, her face pale and drawn like she already knew. "You went down there, didn't you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. Her hands trembled as she grabbed my arm, pulling me inside. "You shouldn't have done that. Now it knows you." "What knows me?" I demanded. What is this place? What's behind that door? She didn't answer, just shook her head and handed me a cup of tea with shaking hands. It doesn't matter now. It's chosen you. Chosen me for what? To take my place, she said, her voice breaking. I stared at her, the words not making sense at first. But then they did. It was a trap. The door wasn't just a doorway, it was a prison, and someone always had to guard it. Her voice cracked as she added, I'm sorry, Clara, I really am. But I've been trapped here long enough. It's your turn now. Before I could process what she'd said, the lights flickered, and a knock echoed through her apartment. The knock sent a cold jolt down my spine. It wasn't like the knocks I'd heard before. This one was deliberate, forceful, and final. I turned to Mrs. Harper, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. It's here for you, she said softly, her voice trembling. For me? My throat tightened, panic building like a tidal wave. What do you mean? I didn't ask for this. I didn't... She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. None of us asked for this, but once the door marks you, there's no escaping it. You either become the guardian, or it takes you. And if it takes you... She trailed off, her expression making it clear that was a fate worse than anything I could imagine. I yanked my arm free, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some elaborate prank, or maybe I was losing it. But the knocking came again, louder this time, shaking the walls. I'm not doing this, I snapped. I'm not becoming some guardian for a door. Mrs. Harper's face twisted with guilt and fear. I didn't want to either, she whispered. But the door doesn't care what you want. The lights flickered again, plunging us into momentary darkness. When they came back, Mrs. Harper was gone. Mrs. Harper, I called out, but the apartment was empty. The cup of tea she'd handed me still sat on the table, steam curling from it like she'd vanished into thin air. The knocking came again, this time from my own apartment. My legs felt like lead as I stepped into the hallway. The door to 4C was ajar, light spilling out into the corridor. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far from Pinewood residences as possible, but I couldn't. My feet moved on their own, pulling me back to my apartment. Inside, the black door was wide open. The staircase yawned before me, the faint, flickering light from below casting shadows that seemed to reach for me. A voice drifted up from the darkness, soft and pleading. Clara, help me. It sounded like James. I hesitated, torn between fear and guilt. If he was really down there, could I leave him? Could I live with myself if I didn't at least try? Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the staircase. The air grew colder with each step, my flashlight barely piercing the oppressive gloom. When I reached the bottom, the distorted hallway stretched out before me again. But this time, it was different. The walls seemed alive, pulsing like they were breathing. And at the far end, where my apartment door should have been, a figure stood waiting. It wasn't James. It was me. The other version of me smiled, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. You finally came, she said, her voice sweet and mocking. What is this? I demanded, my voice shaking. This is where it ends, she replied, stepping closer, and where it begins again. You see, Clara, the door needs someone. It always does. Someone to guard it, to lure others in, to keep the cycle going. I shook my head, backing away. No, I'm not doing this. Her smile widened. You don't have a choice. Before I could react, she lunged at me, her hands cold and claw-like as they grabbed my wrists. The world tilted, the hallway spinning around us in a blur of light and shadow. I fought, kicking and screaming, but she was impossibly strong. You can't escape this, she hissed, her face inches from mine. The door chose you, just like it chose me. Accept it and it'll be easier. I could feel myself slipping, the darkness closing in. But then I remembered something Mrs. Harper had said. It takes you, or you take someone else. Desperation fueled me. I twisted in her grip, reaching for anything I could use as a weapon. My flashlight, it was still in my hand. Without thinking, I swung it as hard as I could. The other Clara shrieked, her grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. If I couldn't destroy her, maybe I could trap her. The door. I turned and ran, sprinting up the staircase as fast as my legs could carry me. Behind me, her screams echoed, growing louder, closer. When I reached the top, I slammed the black door shut and twisted the lock. The padlock. It was lying on the floor where it had fallen. I grabbed it, securing it in place just as her hand clawed at the other side. The door shook violently, but it held. Slowly, the banging subsided, and the hallway fell silent. I sank to the floor, my chest heaving, relief washing over me. But it didn't last. The door was quiet now, but it wasn't over. I could feel it. Its pull, its hunger. It was waiting. A knock came from the other side. I stared at the door, my hands trembling. Then I heard it, a voice from the hallway. "Hi, I'm the new tenant," a man said, his voice cheerful. "Can you tell me about the building?" I wiped my tears, stood up, and forced a smile. "Welcome to Pinewood Residences," I said, my voice steady. The door wasn't done, but neither was I.